thought I forgave him for cheating. I let him believe that until he had nothing left. I met my husband Danny when we were both 24 and broke. We built everything together from the ground up. I worked doubles at the hospital as a nurse while he finished his accounting degree. I packed his lunches and quizzed him on tax law while running on 4 hours of sleep. When he finally got his job at a firm downtown, I cried happy tears because we made it. We bought a little house with a yard and I thought that was it. That was our life. 10 years of marriage and I never once doubted him. Then I found out about Holly. She worked at his firm and had been sleeping with my husband for 8 months. I found out because she texted him a heart emoji at 2 a.m. and his phone lit up on the nightstand. I checked his messages while he snored next to me and read 6 months of conversations about how boring I was and how Holly made him feel alive again. He told her I was basically his roommate at this point. He told her I had let myself go. He told her he was only staying with me because leaving would be expensive. I sat in our bathroom and cried for 3 hours. When I came out, I had a plan. The next morning, I confronted Danny and watched him turn into someone I didn't recognize. First, he denied it. Then, when I told him I read everything, he got mad at me for going through his phone. He said I violated his privacy. He said if I had been more attentive, he wouldn't have needed to look elsewhere. He actually told me that Holly understood him in ways I never could. I asked if he wanted a divorce and he laughed. He said Holly was fun, but she wasn't wife material. He said I was overreacting and that it was just physical. He promised to end it if I could just let it go and move forward. He said couples get through this all the time. Then he asked what was for dinner. I told him I needed time to think. For 2 weeks, I acted devastated. I cried randomly. I slept in the guest room. I asked him questions about Holly and watched him get annoyed that I couldn't just drop it already. He started coming home with flowers and making dinner reservations. He kept saying we should go to therapy, but only if I promised not to bring up Holly every session because that would be counterproductive. His mother called me and said I should be grateful he chose me over the other woman. She said men have needs and sometimes wives get too comfortable. She told me her own husband had a wandering eye and she handled it with grace. I thanked her for her wisdom and hung up. That's when I decided exactly how this would go. I told Danny I forgave him. I told him I wanted to work on us and build something even stronger. He was so relieved that he cried. He said he knew I would come around because I was logical and not emotional like other women. He said we could finally move forward now that I had processed my feelings. I smiled and said I had some ideas about our fresh start. I told him I always felt like his gaming setup in the basement was a barrier to us spending quality time together. He had spent years collecting vintage consoles and rare games. It was worth thousands, but more importantly, it was his pride and joy. He hesitated, but I reminded him that Holly was more important to him than our marriage, so surely I was more important than his game collection. He sold everything within a month. I told him my friend's husband was a bad influence and maybe we should distance ourselves from them. Danny loved hanging out with his buddy Craig, but I pointed out that Craig was the one who covered for him during the affair. He stopped talking to Craig. I told him our house had too many bad memories now, and maybe we should sell it and move closer to my family 2 states away. He agreed because it would give us a blank slate. He put in for a transfer at work and we listed the house. I told him I wanted a joint account for our fresh start, because separate finances felt like we weren't fully committed. He moved his entire savings over. I told him we should wait until we were settled in the new place before having kids. He said whatever I wanted. I told him I wanted to go visit my sister to look at houses in her area. He drove me to the airport and kissed me goodbye. He said he was glad we had passed the hard part. He said he couldn't wait to start our new chapter. I smiled and went through security. That was 7 months ago. I never came back. I filed for divorce from my sister's couch. Danny had already quit his job for the transfer, sold his game collection, cut off his best friend, and sold our house. The house money was split, but I had already moved my half of our savings before I left. His half went to a rental deposit on an apartment he picked out for us. I paid a lawyer with his gaming money. He called me 40 times the first day. First voicemail was begging. Second voicemail was angry. Third through 10th were him trying different approaches, like he was testing which version of himself would get me to respond. I deleted them all without listening past the first few seconds. The 11th voicemail was his mother telling me I was being childish, and that family works through problems instead of running away from them. I blocked her number and went back to unpacking my suitcase in Willow's guest room. My phone buzzed constantly for 3 days straight with texts that shifted from confusion to rage to desperation and back again. Danny sent paragraphs about how we could fix this if I just came home, how he had already made so many changes for us, how I was throwing away 10 years over nothing. He reminded me about the house sale closing next week and how we needed to coordinate the final walkthrough. He asked if I was having some kind of breakdown and needed him to come get me. He told me his mother was worried about my mental state. I forwarded everything to Crystal without reading most of it. She called me on day 4 and told me Danny's messages were actually helping our case because they showed he still didn't understand what he did wrong. She asked if I felt safe and whether I thought he might show up at Willow's place. I told her Danny didn't even know Willow's married name or her address, which was one of the few smart decisions I made during our marriage. Crystal said she would file a motion to prevent him from contacting me directly, and that all future communication had to go through her office. The calls and texts stopped after she sent him that letter, and the silence felt better than any apology he could have offered. Crystal called 2 weeks later while I was restocking supplies in the medication room at my new hospital. Her voice had that particular tone lawyers use when they are about to tell you something that should make you angry, but they are trying to stay professional. Danny's attorney was pushing for mediation to settle everything faster and cheaper. She thought we should refuse because his desperation meant we had leverage, but she wanted my input before responding. I locked the medication room door and leaned against the supply cart, while she explained that mediation could save months of court dates, but might also pressure me into accepting less than I deserved. I asked her what she honestly thought we could get if we went to trial versus mediation. She said trial would take longer and cost more, but the outcome would probably be similar since the facts were clearly on my side. I told her I was willing to mediate if it moved things forward, but I was not compromising on what I was owed. She made a satisfied sound and said she would set it up with terms that protected my interests. Before she hung up, she mentioned that Danny's attorney sounded tired, which she took as a good sign. I went back to counting medication doses and realized my hands were completely steady. I met Willow for coffee 3 days later at a place near her house with good pastries and quiet corners. She hugged me before we even ordered and held on longer than usual, which made my throat tight in a way I was not expecting. We got our drinks and sat by the window where the afternoon light made everything look softer than it actually was. She told me she was proud of how I handled everything, but worried about whether I was actually processing my feelings or just staying busy. I stirred my coffee and admitted I did not know the difference right now, but staying busy felt safer than falling apart. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. She said both things could be true, that I could be strong and still need time to grieve what I thought my marriage was. I had not cried since leaving Danny, and suddenly I was crying in a coffee shop while Willow handed me napkins and blocked me from the view of other customers with her body. She did not tell me to stop or that everything would be okay. She just sat there while I cried about 10 years I could not get back, and a man I thought I knew who turned out to be someone completely different. When I finally stopped, she ordered us more coffee and a chocolate croissant to split, and we sat there not talking for a while in a way that felt more comforting than any words could have been. The mediation got scheduled for 3 weeks out, and Crystal sent me a detailed list of everything we were asking for and why I was entitled to it. I printed the document and read through it twice at Willow's kitchen table while she made dinner. The numbers were fair but firm, and seeing it all laid out made me realize how much I contributed to a life Danny claimed was his achievement. My labor, my money, my support, all of it quantified on paper in neat columns that showed exactly what I gave up while he built his career. Crystal had included the cost of his education, which I primarily funded through my nursing income. She listed the mortgage payments I made during the months he was between jobs. She calculated my contribution to his retirement account through the household expenses I covered, so he could maximize his contributions. She even included the market value of the domestic labor I provided, cooking and cleaning and managing our home while working full-time. The total was substantial enough that I had to read it 3 times to make sure I was seeing it correctly. Willow looked over my shoulder and whistled. She said Danny was going to lose his mind when he saw these numbers, and I realized I did not care if he did. 2 days later, Crystal called to say Danny's attorney had contacted her asking if I would be willing to speak with Danny directly before mediation. She relayed this with obvious skepticism in her voice, like she was reading me something ridiculous she found on the internet. His attorney suggested it might help us reach an agreement more easily if we could just talk things through like adults. Crystal waited for my response with the kind of silence that meant she already knew what I was going to say, but wanted me to say it anyway. I told her absolutely not, that anything Danny wanted to say to me could be said through lawyers in a professional setting. She sounded relieved by my answer and said she would shut down any future requests for direct contact. She mentioned that these kinds of requests usually meant the other side was worried about mediation and trying to find an easier path. I asked if that meant we had the advantage, and she said it meant Danny was finally starting to understand he could not charm or manipulate his way out of consequences. Before we hung up, she reminded me not to respond to any attempts Danny made to contact me outside official channels, and I promised her I would not. I had dinner with Willow and Sebastian the following week, and Sebastian grilled chicken while Willow made a salad that was too fancy for a regular Tuesday. We were halfway through the meal when Sebastian mentioned he ran into someone from Danny's firm at a work conference. The guy recognized Sebastian's last name and asked if he was related to me, then proceeded to tell him that the affair with Holly was common knowledge among Danny's coworkers. Apparently, Danny and Holly were not subtle, and people had been gossiping about it for months before I found out. They had been seen leaving together after work, taking long lunches, and Danny had Holly's photo as his phone wallpaper for a while. I set down my fork and felt humiliated all over again, realizing how many people knew while I worked doubles and packed his lunches. Willow reached over and squeezed my arm. She said those people were not my friends, and their opinions did not matter, but I could tell she was angry on my behalf. Sebastian apologized for bringing it up, but I told him I was glad to know. It made me feel less stupid for not seeing it sooner if they were obvious enough that his entire office knew. My therapist asked me what I wanted my life to look like a year from now, and I sat there on her couch realizing I had no idea beyond not married to Danny. She waited while I tried to come up with something more specific, but everything I thought of felt like it was defined by what I did not want, rather than what I did. I told her this, and she nodded like I had said something important, instead of admitting I had no plan. She suggested that maybe that was enough for now. Knowing what I did not want was the first step toward figuring out what I did want. I left the session feeling like I had permission to not have everything figured out yet, which was strange because I had not realized I was putting that pressure on myself. I drove back to Willow's place and sat in the car for a while before going inside, just thinking about what I might actually want if I was not spending all my energy on what I was running from. Crystal sent over the final mediation prep documents, and I spent an evening reviewing everything with Willow at her dining room table. She read through the financial breakdown while I made notes on the settlement terms Crystal wanted me to push for. Willow suddenly stopped reading and looked up at me. She pointed out that I was entitled to half of Danny's retirement account too, which I had forgotten about. The number was substantial, more than I expected because he had been contributing the maximum amount for years while I covered more of our regular expenses. I added it to the list of things I was not backing down on, and Willow said Danny was going to need a second job just to recover from this divorce. I did not feel bad about it. He told Holly he was only staying with me because leaving would be expensive, so I was just making sure he was right about that. I picked up an extra shift at the hospital and ended up working with a doctor who was going through a divorce herself. We had a quiet moment during a lull between patients, and she asked how I was handling everything. I gave her the short version, and she listened while restocking exam gloves. She told me she stayed 2 years longer than she should have because she was afraid of starting over. She looked at me and said I was brave for leaving when I did, and I realized maybe I was. It had not felt brave at the time. It felt necessary and angry and like the only choice I had left. But sitting there in the break room with someone who understood what it cost to leave, I thought maybe brave and necessary could be the same thing. The day before mediation, Danny sent another email through Crystal begging me to reconsider the divorce entirely. He said he had changed, that losing everything made him realize what matters, that he would do anything to fix this. Crystal forwarded it with a note asking if I wanted to respond. I read it once and felt nothing except tired. I told her my presence at mediation tomorrow was my response, that I was done talking and ready for action. She sent back a thumbs-up emoji, which made me laugh because it felt like exactly the right amount of respect to give Danny's last attempt at manipulation. I walked into the mediation office wearing my favorite dress and the confidence of someone who has nothing left to lose. The building was newer than I expected, all glass and steel with uncomfortable modern furniture in the waiting area. Danny was already there with his attorney, sitting in chairs that faced away from the entrance. He turned when the door opened and I got my first look at him in months. He looked terrible. He had lost weight, enough that his clothes did not fit right and hung off his shoulders. His face was drawn and he had circles under his eyes that made him look older than he was. He could not meet my eyes, just stared at his hands while his attorney stood up to greet Crystal. The attorney looked tired too, like this case had been exhausting for everyone except me and Crystal. We shook hands with the mediator, a woman in her 50s with gray hair and an expression that suggested she had seen every kind of divorce drama and was not impressed by any of it. She directed us to a conference room and explained the process, while Danny kept stealing glances at me like he was trying to figure out if I was real. The mediator opened the session by explaining the process, while Danny's attorney shuffled papers and cleared his throat. He started right away, painting me as someone who tricked Danny into giving up everything important to him. He said I took advantage of Danny's guilt and manipulated him into selling his belongings and leaving his job. He made it sound like I planned the whole thing from the beginning just to hurt Danny, not because Danny destroyed our marriage by sleeping with someone else for 8 months. Crystal sat quietly and let him talk, taking notes while his voice got louder and more confident. When he finished, she opened her folder and pulled out printed copies of text messages between Danny and Holly. She read them out loud in a calm voice, the parts where Danny called me boring and said I let myself go. She read the message where he told Holly he was only staying with me because divorce would be expensive. Then she pulled out a second document showing the timeline of the affair, 8 months of Danny lying to my face while I worked doubles at the hospital. She mentioned his mother's phone call advising me to accept his cheating with Grace, and the mediator's expression changed completely. She looked at Danny like she was seeing him for the first time and not in a good way. His attorney tried to interrupt, but Crystal kept going, laying out every piece of evidence that showed Danny made his own choices and lived with the results. By the time she finished, the mediator was taking notes and Danny was staring at the table. We took a break after 2 hours, and I walked into the hallway to get away from the conference room. Danny followed me out and said my name like it hurt him physically to speak. I turned and looked at him directly for the first time since I left 7 months ago. He looked worse up close, with new lines around his eyes and a desperate expression that probably worked on other people. I waited for some feeling to show up, anger or satisfaction or even sadness about what we used to be. Nothing came. I felt the same way I'd feel looking at a stranger in a grocery store, just blank recognition that another person existed in the same space. He opened his mouth to say something else, but I walked past him toward the bathroom without responding. Crystal was waiting by the water fountain and raised her eyebrows at me, and I shook my head to show I was fine. We went back into the conference room and kept going. The mediation lasted 6 hours total, breaking only for lunch and bathroom stops. Danny's attorney kept trying different approaches, suggesting we split things differently, or give Danny more time to get back on his feet. Crystal shut down every attempt with facts and numbers, showing exactly why I deserved what we were asking for. She brought up the money I spent supporting Danny through school, the years I worked extra shifts so he could focus on his career, the retirement contributions he made while I covered our regular bills. Everything was documented and clear. No room for argument about who contributed what. Around hour 5, I watched Danny's attorney lean over and whisper something to Danny that made his face go pale. They asked for another break and went into the hallway for 15 minutes. When they came back, the attorney told the mediator that going to court would cost Danny more in legal fees than he would save fighting our settlement terms. He recommended Danny accept the agreement we proposed. Danny's hands shook when he picked up the pen to sign the papers. Mine stayed completely steady while I signed my name next to his. Crystal squeezed my shoulder as we gathered our things to leave, and I realized the hardest part was actually over now. Everything else was just paperwork and waiting. The settlement gave me exactly what I earned, half of everything we built together plus repayment for the money I spent on Danny's education. The total came to enough that I could start completely over without worrying about finances for a good while. Crystal broke down the numbers for me in her office after we left the mediation, showing me what would come from the house sale, what came from his retirement account, and what counted as education reimbursement. I had earned every single dollar through years of double shifts and sacrifices Danny took for granted. He kept his car, which was nearly paid off, and his credit card debt, which he created buying gifts for Holly. That seemed fair to me, given he created both situations himself. Crystal said the final divorce papers would take a few weeks to process through the court system, but the hard part was done. I thanked her and left her office feeling lighter than I had in months. Willow and Sebastian took me to dinner at a nice restaurant downtown to celebrate, the kind of place with cloth napkins and a wine list. I ordered what I wanted without checking prices or thinking about whether Danny would like it. Willow raised her glass halfway through the meal and made a toast to new beginnings, and Sebastian joined in with an encouraging smile. I realized sitting there that I actually believed in new beginnings now, not as some vague concept, but as a real thing happening in my life. The future stopped feeling like something to be scared of, and started feeling like something full of options I got to choose. We stayed late talking and laughing, and I noticed I was laughing without having to force it or pretend. The sound came naturally, like my body remembered how to feel happy without permission. Crystal called me at work the following week while I was restocking supplies in an exam room. She said the judge signed off on everything and the divorce was officially final. I was legally free, no longer tied to Danny or the life we built together. She sounded genuinely happy for me, almost excited, and I thanked her for fighting so hard to get me what I deserved. She told me I made her job easy by knowing exactly what I wanted and never backing down from it. She said most people waver or feel guilty and try to be generous to someone who hurt them, but I stayed clear and firm the whole time. That quality was rarer than I probably realized. We said goodbye, and I finished my shift feeling like a different person than the one who walked into that mediation office. I spent the next weekend actually furnishing my apartment instead of living with the bare minimum. I bought a couch in a color I loved, deep blue that Danny would have hated. I picked out artwork for the walls, bright abstract pieces that made me happy to look at. I arranged everything exactly how I wanted it without asking anyone's opinion or compromising on placement. Every single item in my space reflected my taste, my choices, my preferences. Walking through my apartment felt like walking through a physical representation of my independence. Nothing here belonged to Danny or reminded me of our marriage. This was entirely mine. My manager pulled me aside at the hospital during a quiet moment and asked if I would be interested in the charge nurse training program. It came with a significant raise and leadership responsibilities, the kind of career advancement I never had time to pursue when I was supporting Danny's ambitions. I accepted immediately without needing to think about it or discuss it with anyone. My career had room to grow now that I was only focused on my own goals. The promotion felt like proof that I was never the boring roommate Danny described to Holly. I was capable and skilled and valuable, and now I had the space to show it. Willow called me a few days later with news she heard through mutual friends back home. Danny had to move back in with his mother because he could not afford the apartment anymore on his reduced income. Apparently, Holly stopped returning his calls once he lost his job at the firm, which surprised absolutely no one who knew the situation. I felt a small flash of something that might have been satisfaction, but mostly I just felt relieved. None of his problems were mine to solve or worry about anymore. He made his choices and now he was living with them, same as I was living with mine. The difference was, my choices led somewhere better. A coworker set me up on a date with her cousin, insisting I was ready to start meeting people again. I agreed mostly to be polite and because she seemed so excited about it. The guy was nice enough, polite and reasonably attractive, with a decent job and no obvious red flags. We had dinner at an Italian place and talked about normal things like work and hobbies and weekend plans. I spent the whole meal comparing him to Danny in my head, noticing small things he did differently or ways he reminded me of my ex-husband. By dessert, I realized I was not actually ready at all to date someone new. I was polite through the rest of the evening and thanked him for dinner, then drove home to my empty apartment. Sitting alone on my blue couch felt more comfortable than trying to connect with a stranger who did not know anything about what I had been through. My next therapy session happened a few days later, and I brought up the date that went nowhere. My therapist listened while I explained how I spent the whole meal comparing the guy to Danny, and realized halfway through dessert that I wasn't ready. She nodded and told me that not being ready was perfectly fine, and didn't mean I wouldn't be ready eventually. Then she asked what I was afraid of, and I had to think about it for a minute. I told her I was scared of trusting someone again and being wrong, of missing red flags like I did with Danny, of building a life with someone who would turn into a stranger. She said that was a reasonable fear that would take time to work through, and there was no rush to start dating again. I left feeling less broken about the failed attempt. 2 days later, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I almost deleted it without reading, but something made me open it. The message said it was Craig, Danny's former best friend, and he wanted to apologize for covering for Danny during the affair. He wrote that he should have told me what was happening instead of lying for Danny, and he felt terrible about his role in everything. He said he knew it was too late, but wanted me to know he was sorry. I read the message 3 times and felt nothing. Craig made his choice when it mattered, and his guilt now didn't change anything that happened. I appreciated the apology in theory, but I didn't respond. Some people apologize to make themselves feel better, not to actually help the person they hurt. The charge nurse training program started the following Monday, and I threw myself into learning leadership skills and advanced clinical procedures. The instructor was a woman in her 50s who had been a nurse for 30 years, and she ran the sessions like a military operation. We learned how to manage difficult staff situations, handle emergency protocols, and make split-second decisions under pressure. During one simulation exercise, she pulled me aside and commented that I had a natural ability to stay calm under pressure. I thanked her and thought about how I stayed calm while planning my exit from a 10-year marriage, dismantling Danny's entire life piece by piece without him noticing. Some skills transferred in unexpected ways. The training was intense, but I loved it. Loved feeling competent and capable in a way that had nothing to do with supporting someone else's dreams. Willow called me that weekend sounding excited, and I could hear Sebastian in the background telling her to slow down. She told me they were expecting a baby, due in about 7 months, and asked if I was okay with being an aunt. I felt genuinely happy for them, instead of the jealousy I might have felt a year ago when I still thought I'd be having kids with Danny. I congratulated them both and listened to Willow talk about nursery colors and baby names, and I realized I wasn't mourning the life I thought I'd have anymore. I was just living my actual life and finding it surprisingly fulfilling. Being an aunt felt like the perfect amount of family expansion right now. All the joy without the responsibility of my own kids. I ran into someone from my old neighborhood at a coffee shop near the hospital a few days later. She recognized me first and came over to my table, and I remembered her as the woman who lived 3 houses down from us. She asked how I was doing and told me everyone back home knew what Danny did, and most people thought he got what he deserved. She said his mother tried to spin it like I abandoned him, but too many people knew about Holly for that story to stick. I thanked her for telling me and realized I didn't actually care what people back home thought. Their opinions didn't affect my life anymore, and Danny's reputation wasn't my problem to manage or worry about. My 6-month review at the hospital happened right on schedule, and my manager called me into her office with a folder full of paperwork. She went through my performance metrics and patient feedback, all of which were outstanding, and told me I was exactly the kind of nurse they wanted to build their team around. The praise felt earned in a way nothing in my marriage ever did. This was my work, my competence, my achievement. Nobody could take credit for what I'd built here or claim they supported me through it. I walked out of that meeting with a raise and a sense of pride that belonged entirely to me. I tried another date a few weeks later, this time with someone I met naturally at a bookstore instead of a setup. He was browsing the same section I was, and we started talking about the book I was holding. His name was Matthew, and he seemed normal and kind, with an easy smile that didn't feel forced. We got coffee after the bookstore and talked about books and travel and our jobs, and I managed to get through the whole evening without mentioning my divorce. He asked to see me again, and I said maybe, which felt like progress. I wasn't ready to commit to anything, but I also wasn't running away from the possibility. My therapist and I talked about forgiveness during my next session, and she asked if I'd forgiven Danny for what he did. I told her I hadn't forgiven him and I didn't plan to, but I also didn't think about him much anymore. She said that was actually better than forgiveness, that it was indifference, which meant he no longer had power over my emotional state. Forgiveness felt like something I would do for him, and I wasn't interested in doing anything for Danny ever again. Indifference was mine, a blank space where he used to live in my thoughts. I went to dinner at Willow and Sebastian's house the following weekend, and Willow asked if I had any regrets about how I handled everything. I thought about it honestly while cutting into my chicken, and told her my only regret was not seeing who Danny really was sooner. She pointed out that I couldn't have known until he showed me, which was true but didn't make the wasted years feel less frustrating. Sebastian added that some people are good at hiding who they really are, and I shouldn't blame myself for believing the person Danny pretended to be. I appreciated them both trying to make me feel better, but part of me would always wonder what signs I missed. Matthew asked me out for a third date, and I realized I was actually looking forward to it instead of dreading it. We went hiking at a state park an hour outside the city, and the physical activity made conversation easier somehow. He told me about his own divorce 3 years ago, how his ex-wife cheated with a coworker, and he spent a year being angry before he finally moved on. I appreciated that he understood what it was like to rebuild your life from scratch, to learn how to trust yourself again after someone you loved betrayed you. We didn't talk about our exes the whole time, just enough to acknowledge we both knew what the other had been through. The rest of the hike we talked about normal things, and by the time we got back to the parking lot, I was thinking about a fourth date. I finished the training program 2 weeks ahead of schedule and got my official promotion with a raise that made me check the number twice. My first paycheck in the new position showed up in my account on a Thursday morning, and I sat in my car outside the bank staring at the deposit amount. It was more than Danny and I used to make together when we were supposedly building our life as a team. I transferred the money to my savings and watched the balance climb, feeling something settle in my chest that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with knowing I did this myself. Nobody helped me get here. Nobody took credit for my success, and nobody could claim they supported me through the hard parts. This achievement belonged entirely to me. Matthew texted me that afternoon asking if I wanted to grab dinner, and I realized we'd been seeing each other for 2 months without me really noticing the time pass. We met at a small Italian place near my apartment, and halfway through our pasta, he set down his fork and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. He told me he was falling for me and wanted to know if I was ready for something serious, or if he should slow down and give me more space. I appreciated that he asked instead of assuming, and I told him the truth about still processing my divorce and needing to take things slow. He reached across the table and squeezed my hand, saying he was willing to move at whatever pace I needed because he wasn't going anywhere. That simple statement made me trust him more than any grand romantic gesture could have, and I squeezed his hand back. 3 weeks later, Willow called me at 6 in the morning saying her water broke and she was heading to the hospital. I threw on clothes and drove straight there, meeting Sebastian in the waiting room where he looked excited and terrified in equal measure. The labor took 14 hours and I stayed the whole time, bringing Sebastian coffee and updates from the nurses I knew. When my niece finally arrived, small and red and screaming, the nurse let me hold her after Willow and Sebastian had their first moments. I looked down at this tiny person who was part of my sister and felt something shift in my understanding of what family meant. It wasn't about the life I thought I'd have with Danny, the house and kids and traditional setup I'd imagined. It was about the people who actually showed up for me when things got hard, who chose to be in my life and let me be in theirs. This was my family now, this messy, beautiful reality, and it was enough. My phone buzzed while I was still at the hospital, and I saw a message from Crystal asking me to call her when I had a moment. I stepped into the hallway and dialed her number, and she told me Danny's mother had contacted her office asking for my information. Crystal shut it down immediately and wanted me to know in case Danny's family tried to reach me another way. I thanked her and realized I didn't feel anxious about it at all. They had no power over me anymore. No ability to make me feel guilty or insufficient or wrong for leaving. Any attempt to contact me just proved they still didn't understand what Danny did wrong, and that wasn't my problem to fix. Matthew met Willow and Sebastian for the first time 2 weeks later at a casual dinner at their house. I watched him interact with my family, asking Sebastian about his work and complimenting Willow's cooking and offering to help clean up afterward. He held my niece carefully when Willow asked if he wanted to, supporting her head the way the nurses had shown us. After dinner, Willow pulled me into the kitchen while Matthew and Sebastian loaded the dishwasher, and she told me she liked him. She said he seemed steady and kind, the sort of person who meant what he said. I realized I liked him too, and more importantly, I was starting to believe I could trust my own judgment again. Danny had made me doubt myself so completely that I'd stopped believing in my ability to read people. But Matthew felt different in ways I could name now. My 1-year anniversary of leaving Danny passed on a Tuesday, marked only by a therapy session where I talked about how much had changed. I had a career I was proud of, an apartment I loved, a relationship that felt healthy and equal, and a sense of self I didn't have when I was trying to be whatever Danny needed me to be. My therapist asked if I felt like I got my revenge, and I thought about it before answering. I told her I got something better than revenge. I got my life back, the one Danny tried to convince me I wasn't entitled to. She smiled and made a note in her file, and I left the session feeling lighter than I had in months. Crystal forwarded me an email from Danny the following week with a note asking how I wanted to handle it. He wrote that he was in therapy now, and his counselor suggested making amends to people he'd hurt. He wanted to know if we could talk, if I'd be willing to hear him out and maybe find some closure together. I read it twice and felt nothing, but a mild irritation at being asked to participate in his healing process. I told Crystal to respond that I wished him well in his recovery, but I wasn't interested in being part of it. Some bridges aren't meant to be rebuilt. They're meant to stay burned so you remember not to cross back over them. Work offered me another promotion 3 months later, this time to a leadership position that involved training new nurses and developing clinical protocols for the whole department. My manager called me into her office and told me I had a gift for mentoring people through difficult situations, for staying calm when everything was chaos and helping others find their footing. I accepted the position and thought about how surviving my marriage taught me more about strength and resilience than any training program could. Pain has a way of creating unexpected skills, turning your worst experiences into the foundation for helping other people through theirs. Matthew and I moved in together after dating for 8 months, and I was surprised by how easy it felt to share space with someone again. He respected my boundaries without me having to explain them twice, communicated clearly about everything from finances to household chores, and treated me like an equal partner in every decision we made. I realized this was what a healthy relationship actually felt like, and I was grateful I left Danny before I forgot that was possible. Living with Matthew felt like proof that I'd made the right choice, that walking away from my marriage wasn't giving up, but rather making space for something better. Willow called me one evening while I was cooking dinner and told me she'd heard through some mutual friends that Danny got a job at a smaller accounting firm in another state. She said he seemed to be rebuilding his life slowly, starting over somewhere nobody knew about his affair or the divorce. I listened to her relay the information and felt absolutely nothing. No satisfaction that he was struggling, no anger that he was moving forward, no curiosity about the details of his new life. He was just a person I used to know who made choices that ended our marriage, and now he was someone I didn't think about anymore. I booked a long weekend at a small inn on the coast about 3 months after the divorce was final. Danny never wanted to go to the beach because he said the sand was annoying and there was nothing to do. So I spent 10 years avoiding something I loved because it wasn't his thing. I packed a bag with books I'd been meaning to read and drove 4 hours to a town I'd never visited before. The inn was small and charming, run by a couple who didn't ask questions when I checked in alone. My room had a view of the ocean, and I stood at the window for 20 minutes just watching the waves roll in. I ate dinner at a restaurant where I ordered exactly what I wanted without considering anyone else's preferences. The waiter asked if I was waiting for someone, and I told him no, just me, and it felt powerful instead of lonely. I spent the next 3 days walking on the beach in the early morning when the sand was cool and empty. I read 2 entire books sitting in a chair with my feet in the water. I ate at different restaurants every night and tried things I'd never tasted before. Nobody knew me there. Nobody expected anything from me, and the freedom of that made my chest feel lighter than it had in years. On my last morning, I sat on the beach and watched the sunrise, and I realized I was genuinely enjoying my own company for the first time in my adult life. I didn't need someone else to make experiences valid or meaningful. I could do things alone and have them matter just as much. Matthew and I were cooking dinner together on a random Tuesday when he turned off the stove and asked me to marry him. There was no fancy setup, no planned speech, just him standing in our kitchen holding a ring and saying he didn't want to wait for a special occasion to tell me he wanted to spend his life with me. I said yes without thinking, without the fear I expected to feel, without any of the hesitation that should come from someone who's been through what I've been through. He slid the ring onto my finger and kissed me, and I realized this felt completely different because Matthew was completely different. He'd never made me feel like I wasn't enough. He'd never compared me to other women or made me compete for his attention. He treated me like an equal partner in every decision we made, and that's what made me certain this was right. We sat down to eat the dinner we were making, and he asked what kind of wedding I wanted. I told him small, just the people who matter, nothing like the big production Danny and I had. He agreed immediately and said he just wanted to marry me. He didn't care about the rest of it. We planned the wedding over the next few months, and everything about it felt easy in a way planning with Danny never did. Willow was my maid of honor, and she helped me find a dress I actually loved, instead of one that looked good in photos. We booked a small venue that held maybe 50 people, and I made a list of family and close friends who'd actually shown up for me over the years. Sebastian agreed to walk me down the aisle since our father died when we were young, and when I asked him, he teared up and said he was honored. Matthew and I wrote our own vows because the standard ones felt too generic for what we were building together. I wasn't performing happiness this time. I wasn't trying to convince anyone that my marriage was perfect. I was just marrying someone who saw me as a whole person and respected me enough to be honest, even when it was hard. The wedding day arrived, and I woke up feeling calm instead of anxious. Willow helped me get ready, and when I looked in the mirror, I saw someone who chose herself first and ended up with something real instead of settling for something that looked good from the outside. The ceremony was simple and perfect. Sebastian walked me down the aisle, and I saw Matthew waiting for me with tears in his eyes. During our vows, he promised to be honest even when it was hard, to respect my independence, and to never make me feel like I wasn't enough. I promised the same things, and I meant every single word. When he kissed me, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The reception was small and filled with people who genuinely cared about us. Willow gave a speech about how proud she was that I chose myself, and several people came up to me throughout the night to say they were happy I found someone who treated me right. I danced with Matthew, with Sebastian, with my niece, and I felt genuinely happy instead of performing for other people. Our honeymoon was 2 weeks in Italy, and we spent our evenings talking about what we wanted our marriage to look like. These conversations were so different from anything I had with Danny. Matthew and I discussed our career goals and how we could support each other without either person sacrificing their ambitions. We talked about financial planning and agreed to keep some money separate so we both maintained independence. We discussed how to handle disagreements and promised to communicate clearly instead of letting resentment build. Partnership felt like collaboration instead of one person giving up pieces of themselves to make the other person comfortable. I realized this was what marriage should have been all along. 2 whole people choosing to build something together, instead of one person shrinking to fit into someone else's life. I got back from the honeymoon to an email from my manager asking me to come in for a meeting. She offered me the position of Director of Nursing Education, a role that came with significant responsibility and recognition within the hospital system. It meant I'd be training new nurses and developing protocols for the entire department. I told Matthew about the offer that night, and he was genuinely excited for me. He asked what I wanted to do, and when I said I wanted to accept, he opened a bottle of wine to celebrate. I realized I'd built a career I was proud of entirely on my own merit, without anyone taking credit for my work or expecting me to put their ambitions first. Willow and I took our niece to the park on a Saturday afternoon, and while we were pushing her on the swings, Willow asked if I ever wondered what my life would be like if I'd stayed with Danny. I thought about it honestly before answering. I told her I didn't wonder because I knew exactly what it would be like. I'd still be working doubles to support his career while he told other women I was boring. I'd still be making myself smaller to fit into his idea of what a wife should be. I'd still be performing happiness instead of actually feeling it. She stopped the swing and hugged me hard, and when she pulled back, she said she was glad I chose myself. I watched my niece run toward the slide, and I thought about the example I was setting for her by refusing to accept less than I deserve. 2 years after my divorce, I was leading a hospital-wide project on workplace culture and mentoring young nurses through their career development. My marriage to Matthew was strong and equal, built on mutual respect and honest communication. My relationship with my family was closer than ever because I wasn't hiding behind a fake version of myself anymore. I'd built a life that was entirely mine, filled with work I was passionate about, and people who valued me. I thought about the woman who sat in that bathroom crying 3 years ago, reading text messages that destroyed her marriage. I was proud of her for having the courage to leave, instead of accepting the lie that she should be grateful for someone who treated her like she wasn't enough. Matthew and I hosted Thanksgiving at our house with Willow, Sebastian, and my niece. I looked around the table at my chosen family and felt grateful for every single person there. This was what I was supposed to have all along. People who valued me, respected me, and showed up for me consistently instead of making me earn their basic decency. Danny's betrayal hurt deeply, but it also freed me to find what I actually deserved instead of settling for someone who saw me as convenient, rather than essential. My niece asked me to pass the potatoes, and I smiled at how normal and peaceful this felt compared to the tense holidays I spent with Danny's family, trying to be perfect enough to earn their approval. I attended a professional conference the following spring, and I was walking between sessions when I saw Holly standing near the registration desk. She spotted me at the same time, and for a second, we just looked at each other. She walked over and tried to apologize for the affair, saying she knew what she did was wrong and she was sorry for the pain she caused. I listened politely and then told her I was actually grateful it happened, because it showed me who Danny really was before I wasted more years on him. She looked surprised, like she expected me to still be angry or hurt. I walked away feeling completely at peace with everything that happened, because her affair with Danny wasn't the end of my life. It was the beginning of the one I was supposed to have all along. I babysat my niece one afternoon while Willow ran errands, and she followed me around the house chattering about everything from her favorite color to the neighbor's dog. She stopped in the middle of her story about preschool and announced that I was her favorite aunt. I laughed and reminded her I was her only aunt, but she shook her head seriously and said that didn't matter because I would still be her favorite even if there were 100 aunts. Something about her certainty made my chest feel tight in a good way. I realized how much joy there was in being present for the people I loved instead of performing for people who didn't value me. I was building something real through my work, my relationships, and the example I set. This life was so much better than anything I planned with Danny. Matthew booked our Europe trip 6 months in advance, researching hotels and making reservations at restaurants I mentioned wanting to try. Danny used to say international travel was too expensive and we should focus on practical goals, which apparently meant his gaming collection. We landed in London first and spent 3 days walking through museums and eating at pubs before taking the train to Paris. I stood at the top of the Eiffel Tower with Matthew's arm around me and took a photo of the city spread out below us. I texted it to Willow with the caption, "Living my best life," and I meant it completely. We spent 2 weeks exploring cities, trying foods I couldn't pronounce, and making memories that belonged only to us. Every moment felt like proof that I was right to leave. The Nursing Leadership Conference took place in a convention center downtown, and I spent 2 days attending workshops and networking with other educators. On the final day, they announced the Clinical Education Innovation Award, and my name got called. I walked to the stage feeling surprised and grateful, accepting the plaque while people applauded. During my speech, I talked about resilience and reinvention without mentioning my divorce directly, focusing instead on how challenges can redirect us toward better paths. Afterward, 3 women approached me separately to say my story inspired them to make changes in their own lives. I realized my pain created purpose in ways I never expected. I sat in my living room on a quiet Sunday morning 3 years after I left Danny, drinking coffee and watching Matthew read the newspaper. Our house had big windows that let in morning light, furniture we picked out together, and photos from our travels covering one wall. I thought about my career as director of nursing education, the respect I'd earned through my own work, and the future we were planning that actually excited me. I didn't regret the revenge I took because it wasn't really about hurting Danny. It was about reclaiming my power and refusing to be the person he tried to make me. I chose myself, and it turned out to be the best decision I ever made.